Now, if you were in a mood to push back against this modular view of the mind, and I'm sure some of you are in a mood to push back against the modular view of the mind, one thing you could say is, okay, granted, sometimes these frames of mind set in, and I'm not really aware of it happening, and maybe they're triggered by feelings, okay, that does happen, and maybe sometimes I could see a movie that would affect my subsequent behavior in ways I don't even really understand, fine. But there's sometimes when I, the chief executive self, I make a decision, okay? So I may be tempted to eat chocolate or a powdered sugar donut, but sometimes I say, no, I'm not going to do it. It's not in my long-term interest to do it. Well, isn't that proof that the self, the chief executive self, actually exists? Well, I may have bad news for you. I asked Rob Kurzban that question. You may remember him. He was a strong proponent of a modular view of the mind, wrote a book about it, and we heard from him a couple of times already. And his view is that no, ultimately the fact that sometimes we seem to be the ones consciously making the decision, that fact does not ultimately mean that the self exists. Here's how the exchange went when I asked him about this. Tell me what's wrong with this common way of describing a situation involving me. Okay, I really wanted to have the chocolate, and I really felt drawn to it. But, you know, I knew that if I did it today, I'd do it tomorrow, the next day. Next day, eventually, I'd gain weight, and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I, ate so much chocolate. And so I decided not to eat the chocolate. Now, you think that's an inaccurate way of describing what's actually going on in my brain, right?
Yeah, I think that from a lay standpoint, it's fine to talk like that. When you're talking to your, family at the dinner table, it's fine. But I think eventually psychology as a scientific enterprise is going to have to move on from sentences that have pronouns like that. So those sentences are going to have to be something like, there were certain systems in your head which are designed to be motivated to eat high-calorie foods. And those systems had certain kinds of, you can call them motives or beliefs or whatever, representations. And then there's other parts of your head that have motives associated with long-term health. And those systems had certain beliefs about the chocolate and what's a good thing to bring about. And so those modules inhibited, the behavior that was being facilitated by the short-term modules. And so, in that description, there's no word I in there. There's no pronouns that are sort of covering the whole self.
Okay, so this whole issue of conscious decision making is important because after all, we make a lot of important decisions. We decide, should I buy a car? Which car should I buy? Which college should I go to? Which job offer should I accept? And in addition, there are a lot of issues of kind of self-control in the traditional sense that are more consequential than the question of whether to eat some chocolate on a given day. So there's a question of whether I should have a drink, even though last time I had one drink, had a bunch of drinks and wound up kind of making a fool of myself, or should I smoke this cigarette, or should I cheat on my spouse? These are really important questions. It would be nice to know, can this thing that feels like the reasonable me make decisions, or at any rate, is there some sense in which reason can enter the equation, the process by which decisions are made? And is it possible that meditation can empower reason, can magnify the role of reason in these decisions? So this whole thing is worth grappling with. Now, one question I asked Rob Kurzban is, if really, as you say, this all boils down to just kind of modules fighting it out and the more powerful module winning, then why do we have to go through this whole ritual of listening to the reasons on both sides of whether you eat the chocolate or whether you do anything else? Is that just kind of for show or what? And he had two answers, kind of two somewhat conjectural explanations. They're both very interesting. First of all, he said, well, it makes sense that reason would play a role in here. It makes sense that natural selection would design the brain so that when the module that is kind of concerned with long-term health or long-term interests comes up with a reason, on its side of the argument. If the reason makes sense, if there's merit to it, then sure, that reason should enter the equation. So it makes sense that our brains would be designed that way, to give some kind of credit to good reasons. Now, Rob isn't saying that it's the way it feels, which is that, I am this conscious judge adjudicating. The chief executive self hears out the two parties, decides which one has more reason on its side, and then makes the decision. He's not saying that happens, but he is suggesting that somewhere in the system there's some algorithm or something that kind of evaluates the merit of reasons. Now that leads to another question I have, which is, well, why is this process conscious? Why does this all have to enter consciousness? Because after all, presumably you could design a computer program that evaluates the merit of logic or something, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be conscious. So why is it that we have to spend all the time hearing about the pros and cons of the decision before the module with the most power winds up winning? I mean, even granted that a module's generation of a valid reason gives that module more power in Rob's scenario, why do we have to hear about the whole thing? Why don't we just let the decision making happen and then we just hear the verdict? Well, here I think the second question, or the second explanation that Rob had in response to my question enters the picture. So when I said, why does there have to be this conscious rehearsal of the pros and the cons, he said, well, there's a second possible explanation of that. And here's the explanation he gave.
People want to come up with reasons to justify their behavior to other people. Again, this goes back to this public relations thing. So the production of reasons inside your head, my guess is that a large part of the reason that goes on is because if someone ever challenges you or asks you why you did X, Y, or Z, you want to have that in your hand. And you don't want to take actions until you have some reason ready to go, such that if people ask you about it, so if the social world pings you and says, what was the story with that? That you have something ready to go. I think this is why, the marketing people are telling me that consumers need only one reason to buy a product. Is that basically, it's not that one reason dominates all the other features of the product, the price or the quality or the whatever, the brand, who knows. But it's that as long as you have one reason, you can't look like an idiot for making the choice. You can always tell the other guy who asked you why you bought that particular microwave. You say, yeah, well, it has the gizmo. So
the idea here is that, one reason we go through this rehearsal of reasons is so that we'll be prepared to give reasons for our behavior if we're challenged. And I imagine this is especially important if you've done something that, if found out, might meet with real social disapproval or possibly even retribution from an offended party. So for example, if you're having an extramarital affair, now the way you might think of this in modular terms, the decision of whether to have one would be, there's a module that seeks short-term sexual gratification, then there's a module that's concerned about your long-term reputation or is concerned about eventual retaliation, and they're both coming up with reasons for their position. Well, one reason that the module advocating the affair can't come up with is the truth, which is, I wanted short-term sexual gratification, right? That's not an acceptable answer in society for violating a norm. You have to have a better reason than that. So we come up with reasons like, oh, if you knew how emotionally distant my spouse was, you'd understand why I did it, and so on. And this explains why these reasons would be rehearsed consciously, right? If the purpose of the reasons is to be shared with others in the event that we have to give reasons, then it makes sense that it would be the conscious mind that observes and rehearses these reasons, because after all, it seems to be the conscious mind that does the communicating with other people. So the idea here is, an analogy, I guess, would be, suppose there's a corporation, and instead of two contending modules, you have two contending vice presidents. They have very different ideas about strategies, about what they want to do on a particular issue. And so they go to the office of the public relations director, and they each give the reasons that they have for advocating their position. And a lot of the point of this exercise, it's not that the PR director is necessarily going to declare a winner, but rather he or she is just kind of hearing the reasons so that they'll be prepared to share the reasons with the world when the time comes. Now, on the other hand, this does suggest a second way that reason could matter. Because after all, if the policy that one vice president is advocating is going to lead to huge blowback, and the reason that the vice president is giving for it just is not going to carry the day out there with the public, then that counts against the argument that the vice president is making. So you can imagine this PR director saying, no, I'm sorry, that one is just not going to fly. If you don't have a better reason than that we can publicize after we do this, then that counts against the argument that we should do that. So in theory, there could be two separate senses in which reason matters. First of all, as Rob Kurzban suggested, you would expect the brain to be designed such that it pays attention when there are good reasons that it's not in your long-term self-interest to do something. And secondly, to the extent that the reasons you would give people to justify something controversial you've done are not going to fly, are not going to be accepted, then that too counts against kind of the module that is advocating that particular course of action. Okay, so reason can matter, but on the other hand, with certain issues of self-control, in particular true addictions, reason seems to play a less and less prominent role as time goes on. You may deliberate earnestly before you start drinking, and then later develop a drinking problem, and as you become an alcoholic, you kind of skip the deliberation issue. You just drink. You may have a rationale, a standard rationale for doing what you do, but the time for actual reason to enter the equation kind of seems to pass, or with any addiction, with heroin addiction or whatever. So it seems as if modules, in a sense, gain more power with victory. So the module that's advocating doing this thing that may lead to short-term gratification, it seems to get stronger as it kind of wins victory after victory. Your grandmother may have said, be careful about succumbing to temptation that first time, because it's going to get harder to resist thereafter, harder and harder and harder. Well, that actually is the way the system seems to work. And one question is, why is it designed that way? Why is it that modules are given more power with victory? I mean, you could imagine a system where they just take turns, and the deal is, well, this module won last time, the short-term gratification module. Now the more responsible, far-seeing module is going to get to win this time around. But that's not the way it works. Now, why is that? Well, my own pet theory is that actually this is kind of a logical way for natural selection to have designed a modular system of motivation. Because after all, if you imagine, these modules are being built up over time, and probably, the short-term gratification modules often existed in evolutionary time before some of the modules that look farther into the future and worry about long-term consequences. So the modules are kind of being stacked upon one another, and if there's indeed not a kind of chief executive self to adjudicate among them, there have to be rules for how power is allocated among the modules. And when you think about it, it does make sense that one rule would be that modules that succeed in achieving gratification are given more power next time around. So, for example, if back during evolution, there's a module that seeks short-term sexual gratification. And you imagine that there's a situation where it's kind of saying, yeah, go for it, approach her. And there's a module that's saying, no, you'll be rejected, you'll be humiliated, people will make fun of you, whatever. Well, if indeed the module advocating advance prevails and you're not rebuffed and there is the sexual gratification, then in natural selection's terms, that's success. So the gratification is evidence that this module's counsel was, in the terms that natural selection cares about, this module's counsel was, wise, so to speak. I mean, at least conducive to getting genes into the next generation. Similarly, to revisit an example we gave earlier in the course, if there is a module that's saying, those trees off in the distance, I think they could have real fruit. Let's make the effort. Let's go. Well, if you go and you get to the trees, there is fruit. You taste the fruit. It's good. It's sweet. It feels gratifying. Well, then that module, it makes sense that module would have more power next time around because it's got a good track record now. It was right this time, and so it makes sense to go with the past winner. Now, in a modern environment, these rules of the road, the rules that give more power to a module seeking short-term sexual gratification if it achieves the gratification, or more power to a module that seeks fruit if you get the sweet taste of fruit. These same rules can lead people to be addicted to pornography or addicted to junk food. But in the environment they were designed for, these rules actually made sense. And so too with things like alcoholism, various kinds of drug addiction. These are the result of novel features of the environment that allow people to intervene directly in the chemical reward system that back during evolution it wasn't so easy to intervene directly in. So all of this drives home that self-control can be a very important question, and raises a question of how can we achieve it, and can meditation, in particular mindfulness meditation, play a role in helping us get the system under better control? Well, there's somebody who has really looked into that, and it's somebody we've already seen, Judson Brewer, who, as you may recall, did an important study, brain scan study, showing that the default mode network does get quieter during meditation. It turns out he also does work using mindfulness meditation to help people overcome chemical addictions such as smoking. And Judd Brewer recently explained to me, how this works. You get them to view the craving differently. Is that the key?
Yes. So we use an acronym, with smokers in particular, we use this acronym RAIN, where they have to recognize what craving feels like. They have to allow it to be there. So often we push away unpleasant things, and craving's unpleasant, so we try to push it away. And so we don't allow it to be in our body. And if we can't allow it to be there, we can't really investigate it. We can't really allow it to do its thing and come up, do its dance, and go away. So the A is for allow, the I is for investigate. And I think of this as really getting curious. Oh, what does craving feel like in my body right now? And it can even, when you're really curious about something, that actually flips the valence from unpleasant to pleasant, because the craving, which was unpleasant, flips to curiosity, which is pleasant, and it can help us kind of stay with the object. Mm-hmm. And for the N, we use a noting practice. So this is simple Mahasi style noting, where people can note craving as it comes and goes. So tightness, tension, clenching, burning, rising, as the craving comes and goes away. So we use this, other people have used this idea of urge surfing, where you can ride out your urges. And mm-hmm. the RAIN acronym very much helps people get on top of that wave and ride it instead of getting sucked into the craving and using.
So whereas normally you would have the feeling that if you've got a craving, you've got to either succumb to it, surrender to it, or push it away. What you're saying is actually you can do neither. You can sit there and, by observing it, in effect weaken it.
Yes, and you weaken it because you don't feed it. So it's interesting in the language of the Buddha's time, the dependent origination, where craving is this key link in this, this feeling tone comes up, you crave something, you act on it, and by acting on it, you kind of reify a self-concept, which then spins back around and kind of changes the way you interact with future situations that are similar. And they actually describe clinging, another translation of upadana, which is translated as clinging, is also sustenance or fuel. So in an essence, you're fueling that fire every time you act on a craving. And so what we teach people to do is just be with the craving. Notice that it's physical sensations in their body, and mental restlessness or whatever, and that if they don't act on it, they don't fuel it, and they don't feed it. And when you don't feed it, eventually, if it's a stray cat and you stop feeding the stray cat, it doesn't come to your house anymore. If you stop adding fuel to a fire, it eventually burns off.
Okay, so the cat keeps coming to your door. Now that's an interesting metaphor to a psychologist, because it suggests the dynamic of what psychologists call operant conditioning. The classic example of that is just a rat that, presses the bar, food comes out, so the rat keeps pressing the bar. Now, if you quit giving the rat food in response to the pressing of the bar, then eventually the behavior is, as psychologists say, extinguished, and the rat no longer presses the bar. Well, the prospect being raised here is that maybe, basically the dynamics of operant condition work with cravings, so that when you kind of look at a craving mindfully, that's like the rat pressing the bar without the food coming out. Because if you look at it mindfully, it doesn't get a grip on you, you don't follow it, you don't smoke the cigarette or have the drink or whatever. And I guess in this metaphor, then kind of just pushing the craving away would be more like, not letting the rat anywhere near the bar in the first place. And, that could work. That could be an effective self-control. I would imagine that it winds up having different properties from the mindfulness therapy that Judd Brewer is talking about. And it may be that if you just keep pushing the craving away, then when the craving does arise in full-bodied form, maybe you're less capable of resisting it. I don't know. It's an empirical question. But one other interesting question related to this is whether you could view a lot of other exercises of mindfulness as basically operant conditioning. So, for example, when you feel rage, if you pound your desk and yell at someone, which after all feels kind of good, when you're in a rage, is that the reward that reinforces the behavior? Is that, in other words, has the module been deemed successful? If you scream and nothing bad happens, nobody retaliates, is that defined as success in natural selection's terms? Or if you feel hatred, and as a result you go around talking in very unfavorable terms about the person you hate, which after all feels good, right? I mean, especially if it turns out the person you're talking to shares the opinion, or you feel you've persuaded them that this person you hate is a bad person. Well, is the talking about the person you hate a reward for the behavior? Is it, and by design, again, is the idea that the module that generates the behavior or the hatred has succeeded in natural selection's terms if it leads you to successfully kind of denounce the person? That to me is a very interesting question. It's a speculative question for sure, but I do think it's possible that yes, it makes sense to think of modules in a not quite literal sense as kind of organisms that operate according to the principles of operant conditioning, and to think that when we exercise mindfulness, we may have the ability to alter their behavior via the principles of operant conditioning, so that when we look at a feeling like hatred or rage mindfully, and so it doesn't translate into the behavior that it would normally translate into, then we are draining the kind of long-term power from that module, rather than letting it amass more and more power. Okay, so far in this lecture we've seen three kinds of connections between mindfulness meditation and the modular view of the mind. First of all, the default mode network that gets quiet during mindfulness meditation, and for that matter during other kinds of meditation, can be viewed as, and maybe is best viewed as, different modules kind of vying for your attention. Okay. Second, by being mindful of feelings, we can, in principle, determine which modules are and are not allowed to kind of take over the mind. And then third, by exercising this mindfulness, we can affect the long-term power that different modules have. We can drain power from some modules and maybe empower other modules. Okay, now let's turn to what is in some ways a deeper connection between meditation and the modular view of the mind. In the final segment of this lecture, we're going to hear from some people who have had meditative experiences that convince them that the self does not exist. And we're going to look at those experiences in light of the modular view of the mind and see if that tells us anything about what's going on in their minds when they have these experiences, and even whether these are kind of valid experiences of insight.